and something that I like to point out to people is, a lot of people ask me, why is it so bad now? Why have things gone so badly? Why is all this coming to the surface? And my response is, this has always been there. The United States is foundationally, a country founded for and by straight white men.
Welcome to Pod Talks. Pod Talks is a project of protecting our democracy, where we bring together the best minds in New Jersey and beyond to talk about some of the biggest challenges facing our democracy, institutions, and personal freedoms. I'm Sean Spiller, Chair of Protecting Our Democracy. Joining us today is the Director of Content and Editorial Strategy for the Anti-Defamation League Center on Extremism, Jessica Reaves, to talk about challenges we are facing with the rise of extremism in our country. Jessica, thank you so much for joining us, and I'm looking forward to what I know will be a great discussion.
Thank you so much for having me. Yes, I always like to say I bring the terrible news, but we also try to come with some solutions and ideas for how to combat extremism. So yes.
Well, that is going to be key, and I thank you for it. And before we get to it, as I mentioned before, Jessica is the Director of Content and Editorial Strategy for the Anti-Defamation League Center on Extremism. She has written extensively about the foundational role of misogyny within a range of extremist groups and movements, including incels and white supremacy. Before joining the Center on Extremism in 2014, Jessica was a staff reporter for the Chicago Tribune and the Chicago News Cooperative and Time.com. And again, welcome and thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Maybe we'll start off if you can just kind of give us the overall state of things, if you will. We've seen a rise in extremism since the Trump election in 2016, but I think we'd all agree it's had a broad influence on our civic discourse. So where do you see us right now as to where we are in relation to the effect that has had?
Yeah. Well, thanks so much for having me for this really important conversation. As you mentioned, we are seeing all measures of extremism rising. We are seeing increased visibility from extremist groups, whether that's via propaganda, flyers and banners over overpasses, which I know a lot of people have seen and reported, flyers in downtown areas, stickers on, like energy boxes everywhere. We've seen that, but then we've also seen much more explicit displays. I'm sure most of your listeners are familiar with what happened in Florida a couple of weeks ago, when we saw some neo-Nazi and white supremacist groups marching through Orlando and the Orlando suburbs, waving Nazi flags and throwing Hitler salutes, and also protesting, a different group protesting outside of Walt Disney World, which is part of an ongoing campaign that these extremists are having against Walt Disney World for its perceived, quote-unquote, progressive policies. So that's just one area that we're seeing, but it definitely is having a really big impact in terms of visibility. We've also seen an enormous number of swatting events this summer, and that's a really dangerous trend that we are watching and that is, taking up a lot of our time in terms of monitoring and research and work with law enforcement. For anyone who's not familiar, swatting is when you call in a troll will call in a false law enforcement report, sort of a false bomb threat or something like that, which will cause law enforcement to show up at a synagogue or a mosque or another religious institution and have to, A, terrify everyone inside, and B, disrupt all of the services that are happening and do a full sweep. So we've been trying to coordinate as best we can to try to make sure that people understand where these threats are coming from broadly, but also, how to respond in the most measured way possible, because you never want to, and that's a challenge because you never want to be telling people it's not happening when in fact it's the one time that it is. So as you can imagine, this creates a lot.
Challenge. Yeah.
Oh yeah, a lot of stress and anxiety. But yes, all measures of extremism, anti-Semitic incidents, white supremacist propaganda reports, and various, all the propaganda and all the activities we're seeing. It's a really challenging time, a really disturbing time for those of us who work in this space.
Maybe if I was to drill down on that a little bit, and maybe I'm guided by, I saw a recent NPR report on just on civic discourse and just how it's been devolving at all levels, right? Their story was on at a very local level, but what if, that I think the examples you gave, people can very clearly understand and relate to how extreme they are, right, and the impact and the fear tactics and the other pieces with it. But what has been that spillover effect? I'm not going to use the word in air quotes, the average person, but in our average, I go to my meeting, school board meeting, I go to a town
Yes.
meeting, I go to a legislative hearing, just all of these entities. It seems that there's been some impact there as well, just in the way people are interacting, the way conversations occur, the way differences of opinion are expressed. Do you see that as an extension of some of the extremism that has almost been accepted by some of our highest individuals in elected office, or do you think they're disconnected in some way?
No, I think there's absolutely a through line. I think in the last 8 or 9 years, we've seen just a massively increased acceptance for intolerance for extremist language, extremist commentary in the public sphere, and that includes public officials, elected officials. And I think what you're referring to here is particularly interesting. We're seeing so much of this extremist language, whether it's conspiracy theories about, that came out of QAnon of all places, whether we're seeing, white supremacist talking points, whether we're seeing anti-LGBTQ plus extremism and bigotry. It's surfacing in so many of these public spaces. So as you mentioned, school board meetings, town forums. We just wrote a piece about how extremists and bigots are capitalizing on the open mic sections of these public events, and are just hijacking them essentially to broadcast their white supremacist talking points and anti-Semitic talking points. And you get to, you have to ask yourself, in a country that is dedicated to, rightly, the First Amendment, what are sort of what kind of pushback can you have? When does free speech become hate speech? But to your point, more broadly, there has been a total devolution of public discourse in the last 8 or 9 years. It has been remarkable and shocking, even to those of us who spend our days staring at this stuff.
Yeah, well, add me to the group of shocked as well. But one of the areas I think maybe I'm less familiar with and want to hear a little more about is you speak and you've done research on the role of misogyny in these extremist groups, and trying to see how does it all connect with what we hear in the media often doesn't focus on that. Obviously we hear about the rallies, we hear about who's there and what's happening, but maybe there's not as deep a dive to kind of get to the studies you've done. So can you maybe just spend a few minutes connecting that for us?
Yeah. A few years ago, we published a report where we essentially looked at white supremacist language and the language that you see in misogynistic online spaces.
Right.
So, for listeners who aren't familiar, and I hope as many people as possible are not familiar with these groups, but the main misogynist groups that we look at are incels, or involuntary celibates. Some of your listeners may be familiar with them from some of the violent attacks that they've perpetrated. There was an attack at a yoga studio in Tallahassee a few years ago that left a number of women dead. The most famous incel in American history is probably Elliot Rodger, who perpetrated a mass shooting outside of Santa Barbara. He tried to get into a sorority house out there and was unable to, and so just started shooting people in the street. These men believe that they have been wronged by the system and that women are using their romantic or sexual power as a weapon against men. And so they believe that because they cannot get dates or have romantic attachments in the way that they would like, that women are to blame and that society is to blame and feminism is to blame, and that one of the answers to that is violence. So that's one segment that we see. We also look at pickup artists who use a lot of, rape terminology, talk about men's rights activists who talk about women taking men's opportunities in the workplace, in public offices, that sort of thing. And again, these groups can become violent. Some of the people who believe these sorts of things are just online and venting, which okay, fine. We watch that all the time. We keep track of what the conversations look like. But there are cases where people become violent because they have been sort of ginned up by these ideas and these ideologies that they do find online and that they do sort of get into an echo chamber around. But one of the threads that runs through all of these misogynistic ideologies is this victimhood narrative. It's about how men have been supplanted or men have been dethroned in a way by women, by women's advances, by, Title IX, by gender equity programming. And that is exactly the same narrative that we see in the white supremacist space. It's the victimhood narrative. It's, white men are losing their power in this country. White men are being supplanted by people of color, by, again, straight white men being supplanted by, quote unquote, an LGBTQ plus army. There are so many through lines on the narratives here. And just the sense of being victimized, the sense of being endangered somehow has become a connective tissue really for these straight white men. And, some people in the manosphere, which is how we refer to the misogynistic spaces online, are not white, but they do subscribe to a lot of the same ideas about men and their spaces in the world. So, Andrew Tate is an interesting example. He very much is in that sort of misogynistic community, and has attracted a huge number of especially young men into his sphere, despite being somebody charged with multiple counts of rape and sex trafficking. They see him as this sort of hero. So there's this really dangerous, and again, we see that same sort of parallel in the white supremacist world, where there will be these individuals who kind of rise up through the ranks and become figureheads for their ideologies.
Do you see, and maybe it's intentional, maybe it's not, it's who's there, or maybe it doesn't happen, but do you see any intentional attempt or otherwise of maybe those in the white supremacy groups to kind of go into those spaces and recruit, or vice versa? Like, is there a mixing of that, or do they, kind of pretty much stay separate even in their extremism?
Yeah, absolutely. No, there's very much a crossover there. When I started looking at incel forums, probably in 2017, it was very much focused on women, how women are, women are the enemy. They want to date women, but they also want to kill women. It's this very weird and very violent dichotomy that they have going on. Today, and for the last couple of years, that has been really infected with a lot of white supremacist commentary, a lot of
Mm-hmm.
anti-Semitic commentary. So it all becomes part of like a larger race and religion conversation, which was not the case before. So I cannot help but think that there are elements of the white supremacist world that are coming into these misogynistic spaces, either because they feel welcome there or because they see this as a ripe ground for recruitment.
It is. Last year there about how one space may influence the other, or recruit from the other, but I guess I'd ask next, are we seeing it also, creep into some of the policy making that's happening, especially nationally? I guess I'll back into it when we see attempts to curtail rights, whether it's, abortion rights, reproductive health care. We see the decisions that are happening when we see, some of the rhetoric that's out there from some of the governors with some of these extreme policies. How much of it are you seeing that is being influenced, from the chat spaces and groups that you see there, and as we're calling them, radical or extreme, but it's spilling into the mainstream and becoming part of literal policy that's being enacted.
Yeah. Yeah, it's been very odd and a little bit, and not a little bit frightening to watch kind of the just this seismic shift from, let's say, what we were experiencing as a country, what we were seeing as a country in 2014, let's say, and what we're
Mm-hmm.
seeing today. I mean, the we have to point to the fact that there has been progress on some fronts. We've seen much more, many more freedoms enacted for LGBTQ plus people. We've seen certain iterations of civil rights, improved. But on the other hand, these extreme elements of legislatures, which are now becoming part of, as you mentioned, the mainstream conversation, are pushing so many really extreme agenda points that we find it, as you mentioned, it's part of politics now. Like, it's part of every conversation you have about abortion rights is now, very much influenced by this idea that women are secondary, second class citizens. Women do not deserve autonomy over their own bodies. And that's not a mistake. That's not an accident. There is, and something that I like to point out to people is, a lot of people ask me, why is it so bad now? Why have things gone so badly? Why is all this coming to the surface? And my response is, this has always been there. The United States is foundationally, a country founded for and by straight white men, or putatively straight white men. So anyone who is outside of that has been fighting an uphill battle since the founding of this country. We know that. And I think what we're seeing is a lot of this very deep-seated racism, misogyny, anti-Semitism it's coming to the fore. It was always there, but now it's socially acceptable, or in the mainstream, sort of acceptable to talk about these things and to use this language. And that, to me, is a really dangerous and disturbing shift that I think has just massive ramifications for communities across the country.
Do you put that shift, right on Trump's election, or you picked up a date, right, 2014, and couldn't agree more with everything you're saying. I just reflect on it growing up. You often thought about what someone might be thinking, and you probably had a pretty good idea. But at least up till 2014, and as it built to that, people weren't maybe saying it out loud or saying it to your face or whatever else. And then it just seemed that we're in a space now where it is just like, as you said, it's at the forefront, and people are just so comfortable with some of the things that they're willing to say and to speak about. I mean, even an elected office, probably back in 2014, if you were, openly talking about some of these extremist views, it would not matter your party. It would not matter. I mean, you were called out, and they still existed, of course, but it was, pushed, if you will, maybe underground or something like that. But now it just seems to be way more open and just out there. I mean, what is that? Is that a Trump effect, or has it been building to that? How do you see the influence there?
I will start by saying that ADL is a nonpartisan organization. I think that the election of Trump was in many ways a response to and a pushback to the election and re-election of Barack Obama. So it was sort of like, and the fact that his primary opposition was a woman in 2016. Like, I think we cannot separate the election of Donald Trump from the fact that a lot of people were angry about, a black man having been elected president twice. And a lot of people were really upset and horrified by the concept of a woman leading this country. So those two things, I think, created a bit of a wave that helped Trump get elected. And then, there is also, you have to look at the fact that, Trump said a lot of these things. He made it okay. People kept, every time he would say something outrageous, people would say, well, that has to be it. That has to be the point. That has to be, and we thought it back in 2016.
Include me in that. I heard. I just
Yes.
remember how many times I said that. I was like, oh,
Remember when the Access Hollywood tape came out, and it was like, oh, there's no way this guy is going to get elected. The fact that he got elected after that came out, after that came to light, tells you everything you need to know about how seriously, or in this case, not seriously, this country takes sexism and, misogyny writ large. Um, too many people, including elected officials, including members of law enforcement, including people who have, the capacity to stop this if they wanted to, dismiss these conversations. And we heard this come up frequently during the last administration as well. They dismiss these conversations as locker room talk or boys will be boys. Well, that's not okay. And that's not how we should be, having conversations in this country. The total, again, devolution of public conversation and public discourse. You can't point to any one person, but certainly the tenor shifted dramatically once Trump got into the White House.
Yeah. So how is all this, impacting us right here in New Jersey? We spoke before about, some of the swatting, and that impact, of course, and extremist groups and others, leading the way there. We're all connected, internet, so of course that's right here in Jersey, like it is everywhere else. But when we talk about our schools, our houses of worship, or our neighborhoods overall, in what ways, is this rise affecting everybody in your kind of everyday life?
Yeah, I think that, New Jersey is no different than any other state in that it is, you know, hugely impacted by this rise. There has been just, every community in New Jersey, I'm confident, has experienced this in one way or the other. They've seen propaganda on a signpost. Maybe they didn't know what they were looking at, because some of these white supremacist groups use very toned down language about, reclaiming America and or sort of defending our heritage. That is the coded language that some white supremacist groups use. But I mean, it would be very surprising to me if there's anyone in New Jersey who has not encountered some form of this, of white supremacist propaganda, or has not been impacted in some way by an extremist act. Because we are at a point now where, as you mentioned, the internet means that we are all, incredibly connected. The threads run very deep underground, and every single white supremacist incident, every single propaganda distribution, every single swatting effort, every attack has just a tremendous ripple effect. And you cannot separate or say, well, this impacted one person or one congregation or one school. No, it impacted every single person who has any connection to any of those institutions. And that's what I think we need to remember, sort of as we talk about community resilience and we talk about how do communities come together in the face of these horrible acts.
Well, you mentioned something in there, institutions, right? And certainly, this is protecting our democracy. The function and functioning of institutions, we rely on them, right? Democracies don't exist unless people have faith on some level in their institutions and know that they're operating to kind of help preserve a democracy and support the people. But, when we saw January 6th, we saw the violence that was there. We've seen the prosecutions that have come after that. But
Yep.
kind of on balance, where do you see us in terms of the risk of something like a January 6th again, an overt attack on our democracy, on our institutions, from those in the extreme, trying to whether it be overturn an election or something else? How do you peg the risk, I guess, of the threat right now of overt violence like that?
Yeah, so on the one hand, I think there was a fairly significant correction after January 6th among at least law enforcement, federal law enforcement, looking at these threats as more seriously. I would argue that, we have not seen sort of, again, I will talk about sort of like the universal experience that I think we probably all had watching, well, not all of us, obviously, but many of us had watching January 6th was thinking like, well, this is clearly it. Like, this is a watershed moment. People will stop and think and they will say, I need to, get away from these conspiracy theories. I need to stop believing in this nonsense. But in fact, what we've seen is people continuing to dig in even further in response to what happened on January 6th and in response to the prosecutions that happened, as a result of it. So that I think is a really dangerous point and sort of inflection point for us. we are in a, people talk about this a lot. We were in sort of a post-truth era where we do not have a universal, meaning like national understanding of what is real, of what is the truth. We don't have facts that we can all rely on. That has been decimated in part by elected officials who refuse to acknowledge reality, but also aided and abetted, I think, by a media that has not been strong enough in their pushback to people who are espousing falsehoods, abject falsehoods. There's this idea, you and I both remember in sort of the 80s and 90s when all the accusations were about how the media was too liberal. It was too liberal. It was too much on the side of quote unquote Democrats. It had too much of a slant. And what we've seen, I think, probably in the last 15 or 20 years is this, I think, overcorrection on the part of the media because they're so terrified of being considered quote unquote too liberal that they present both sides of an issue, even when one side is demonstrably true and the other is demonstrably false. And, sometimes that's fine. You want to get two sides of the story about, who tripped on a sidewalk and who's responsible for the sidewalk and who should fix it and all that. Great. But when we're talking about fundamental, concepts that define this country, there are no two sides. There's right and there's wrong. There's fact and there's fiction. And I am very, very concerned that I very much hope that the media has learned its lesson in broad terms as we come up to the 2024 election cycle. I am very concerned, however, that that is not the case.
Yeah, well, I think we've already seen some criticisms out there of situations exactly as you described, where kind of both sides are presented, or things aren't fact checked in real time and things of that nature. So
Yeah.
a challenge for sure, but as you noted, it seems to be at least still continuing at this time. Protecting our democracy, right? The goal of it is to bring people together, to support our basic rights and freedoms. And I know as we started this together, you mentioned, you're going to bring some optimism. So we're going to bring it to that part of it as well, right? That we can do something about this, that we can fight for our rights and be successful. Can you share a little bit about the work at the ADL and what the ADL is doing? We talked about the media there. I heard you say before, kind of monitoring spaces, in some of your other answers. But what is the ADL doing to combat the extremism that we are seeing, and what ways, working with other allies and other partners to kind of get us back to a little more civility, honesty, truth, as you just noted, in our democracy?
Yeah. I mean, ADL is a very strong coalition partner for a lot of, interdenominational, interracial groups, very much on the ground in communities. ADL's regional offices, we have 26 around the country, are really the heart and soul of that kind of work. The national offices tend to, of which I am part, we are often focused on the problems. And in my mind, the regional offices are kind of the solution finders and the doers and the people who are out in the community making those connections, showing up at mosques to show support, showing up at different events that reinforce our dedication to civil rights. And I think, so I would say building those communities, enforcing or strengthening those communities. And one of the most powerful things that ADL does is work with kids in schools. Our No Place for Hate programs reach thousands and thousands and thousands of kids across the country. And it's such a huge kind of hallmark for a lot of these schools, where they learn about bullying, they learn about name calling, they learn about all of these things that start small and that can really infect a school, a person, a friend group, whatever, and push them further down a path that then we at the Center on Extremism, may encounter them years later. So I think for me, that's one of the most powerful indicators I see is the work in lower schools and middle schools and upper schools. and just how powerful it is to have peer-to-peer conversations about what it means to be tolerant, what it means to be, accepting, and what it means to be kind. And I think it always comes back to that. It sounds pat, but I really believe that's what it comes back to.
As you describe it, and being a teacher myself, anytime you're thinking of kids and the work you're doing there, it brings you joy, and I think that's certainly optimism. And we look at the next generations and what that means. How much are you able to hang on to that when your focus is the center on extremism? So probably you're in a little bit different space. You're not as much able to work with the kids side. You're in these chat groups, or you're in these you're reading these conversations, I guess. I mean, how hard is it for you to stay upbeat and positive about the work ahead and what we're doing? When I would imagine you're seeing constantly just things that are just shocking and appalling and scary.
Yeah, we talk about this a lot at Center on Extremism. We just, we as a staff, we talk about it. We talk about coping mechanisms. We have, programs for staff to talk about, some of the maybe trauma that they've experienced just by being in these chat rooms day after day after day. Um, you know, I take an enormous amount of comfort in knowing that I'm working with the best in the business, just really compassionate, thoughtful, um, dedicated people who work literally 24/7 to try to make people safer across the country, and to try to expose, extremism for what it is. On a more personal note, I will say that my time as a reporter definitely helped me build up some calluses and some compartmentalization techniques. You look at terrible things all day. You can't bring that home with you every single night and it not have an impact. So I think I learned relatively early, certainly many years ago, how to turn off that part of my brain to some extent.
Okay.
You're never totally successful. It's there. And I think for all of us, I don't want to speak for others, but, based on conversations that I've had with colleagues, it does start to, it creeps into your interactions in the world. It creeps into how much you worry about things, how much you are sort of expecting bad things to happen. And that's, it's, I think the cost of this job, but generally speaking, I am just, I think we all do a pretty good job of trying to focus on finding solutions, trying to focus on the fact that, okay, we're doing this work so that we can stop, hopefully, people from being hurt or killed. That is what keeps us going.
No, couldn't be more important. That I guess last thing I'll ask: what are you most optimistic about? Obviously the work with children and trying to make that something that they grow into and live as adults, and in just a positive way, as opposed to going down the wrong path. The work you guys are doing all the time to keep people safe and find those who might move to violence through extremism. But we also know, right, we're seeing more of this overtly. There's the challenges around that. Are you optimistic that we, turn that corner, move things in a better direction sometime soon, or how optimistic are you that we, move this in the right direction?
Um, Honestly, I will say that some days I am more optimistic than others. I will say that an odd sort of unexpected upside to more extremism in the world, more visible and explicit extremism in the world, means that more, quote, average people are aware of it and are more aware of the threat, and are therefore sort of arming themselves with more information and more techniques that we talk about in terms of community building. Um, More people are coming to organizations like ADL, like SPLC, like ACLU, to talk about, I'm seeing this in my community and I'm really scared. What do I do? So you never, of course, want to applaud the spread of extremism. And I hate that people are more afraid now, maybe, than they were 10, 15 years ago. But the odd upside of that is that with awareness comes more people learning tools for pushing back. And it means more people are able to have conversations with people in their families, let's say, who may be headed down the path. of extremism, whether that's conspiracy theories or racism or misogyny or anti-Semitism, any of those things. We want to make sure that we're not just telling people things are bad, because they kind of are. We want to make sure that people understand, hey, you have the power, to have these conversations and derail possibly someone's path into extremism. It's it comes down to the individual conversations, as with everything, pretty much, right? I mean, that's how we solve a lot of problems. It's just coming together and having conversations like we are
Yeah.
here today.
That's right. And as you said, as we build that density, certainly, a positive as you note that more and more people educating themselves, looking to reach out for the tools to push back. Hopefully it does arrest, stop someone who's moving down a path. And the more of us that are in that space stopping others, maybe that's the path forward. Maybe that's how we move beyond this in some ways. So, but listen, I would do want to thank you so much for the conversation today. I think it's just really important stuff. It's scary, no question, but I think we all at least see pieces and places where we can do something to help, to help us move in a positive direction. And I think that's what this is all about. So thanks so much for spending a little time with us today, and I thank you for it.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. I enjoyed it.
Great, thank you.